One question we can stop asking in Formula 1 2019 is, can Mercedes win every single race through the season? For us, I think that's a relief. They've been beaten at last by Red Bull, but how did it happen and why did it happen? I've got Jake Boxall-Legge and Edd Straw here to discuss what went on over the Austrian Grand Prix weekend and if it's a one-off or gives us perhaps some pointers for the rest of the season. So Ed, we've been waiting for a Mercedes Achilles heel, as they put it, to arrive this year, and we finally got it in Austria. Cooling problems, which really hurt the pace of the car. Just how bad did it get in the race, and what do you think? Is this a one-off? Is it something they can solve, or could this become a bigger issue through some more of the European summer races?
Well, in terms of how serious the Achilles heel, as Toto Wolff, the team boss, called it, is concerned, it completely defined their race. Both Bottas and Hamilton were contained, if you like. They could just drive to the cooling requirements of the power unit package. They were both being given instructions to lift and coast for about 400 metres a lap. That's just over 8% of the lap around the Red Bull ring. So that is a lot of lifting and coasting. And that was not for fuel saving, specifically for the power unit, because the cooling situation. Obviously very high temperatures there, unusual, unexpected. Perhaps we saw record temperatures not too far away in France. So unusual conditions. I think this is not really a major weakness for the rest of the season, because these were really unusual conditions, unexpected conditions. But I think what it does reflect is clearly the general philosophy is any air you're using for cooling, any airflow you're using for cooling, you can't use for performance in the form of downforce. And in terms of your philosophy of your car, you're better off perhaps being a little bit more aggressive with your cooling, because obviously as long as you can unleash the performance over a single lap without things going wrong, you can manage it in the race. And all teams do this. They're not setting, right, what's the maximum cooling requirement we need in terms of airflow to go at 100% in a race, because they know they can manage it. However, this did tip beyond what they really needed, but I don't think we're going to see this happening every race, but it did utterly define their performance. At one stage, Lewis Hamilton, after his first pit stop, just said, well, so do I just sit here? Basically meaning you're driving to that pace, you're lifting and coasting, and that's exactly what they had to do.
JBL, that talk about balancing aero performance versus cooling brings us nicely into your area of specialisation. And we've talked at length about the fact that the Mercedes seems to be the best car this year. We know they're not relying on just the power of the engine to drag it around. It's a great chassis, great aero package, but they had to sacrifice a bit of that, as Ed mentioned. What sort of things were they able to do, and did they eventually just run out of options to make the problem go away?
Yep, so it's been a while since I've done some screen pointing, so let's do that now. So you can see the two cooling outlets here. They've sort of experimented with this over the season, running different levels of cooling in that area. The radiator just sits kind of diagonally along here, and so this is behind the radiator. You have the lovely cool air coming through, and this draws out some of the hot air immediately from the radiator assembly, and then you have the stuff at the back where they try and open up the cooling as much as possible. But throughout the weekend, we saw these particular bits getting opened out more and more and more. They didn't have a tighter bodywork package at the back, so they couldn't really open that up so much, which perhaps hindered them. And obviously, given the opportunity to go again, they probably would have brought perhaps some wider bodywork for the rear of the car. Toto Wolff did say after the race, the only next option was to just take all the bodywork off. So yeah, Mercedes really hit some troubles there. Things were just getting far too hot. As Ed said, they had to manage it. You know, it was like 400 metres of lift and coast a lap. That's a huge amount. Like, that's like a running race level of management. So yeah, there's a lot of considerations there. Those are still quite small outlets, really, first and foremost. They could try and just cut a massive hole in, but that's not going to work for the aerodynamics. So yeah, they kind of hit a limit of what they could do with the cooling. And for hotter races later in the season, that's something they're going to really have to look at.
And it was really hot there, really hot. You know, one of those ones where you just can't get any cool air, even just standing outside for a while. It was bad, so you can't underestimate just how unusual the conditions really were there.
It was like a Glastonbury tribute act with all the tents on the grid as well.
Yeah, usually used for rain.
Yeah, I think everybody agreed it was exceptional temperatures and not necessarily something Mercedes would have planned for. I'd have liked to see them run without bodywork. It'd be good to get a real proper look at the internals of the Mercedes Formula One engine. But
It's a bit retro as well, isn't it?
I really think we should see a bit more of that, but I can see why they didn't do it. Let's move on to Ferrari. Obviously had the fastest car at the weekend in Austria, didn't win the race. We've been seeing updates gradually appearing, JBL, on the Ferrari for the last couple of races. We're going back to the French Grand Prix first, because it all kind of started with a front wing update, and then more pieces have appeared kind of behind that for Austria as well to try and optimise it. So what did they do with the front wing initially?
What they ran with in Canada beforehand, which is essentially the same spec that they've run with for the opening course of the season. And then Mattia Binotto said, going into France, okay, we're going to debut this new upgrade package. It's kind of going to define what we do. It's not going to specifically make all of our problems go away, but this is going to be a first step into looking at a new direction for the upgrade package. They've taken the general concept of their front wing, they've just lifted that leading edge a little bit more, and the rest of the elements have followed, just to try and improve the outwash characteristic of that front wing. Something I've talked a lot about in pre-season. I feel like we're going a little bit retro with that as well. And so they have this little fin here. They've had to flatten out the footplate a little bit there, just to try and get it within the bounding box. The footplate has to be a certain size, and so that's kind of a little bit of trickery to get around that. So yeah, that's the front wing. As you maybe doesn't look too dissimilar, but obviously when you're throwing it in CFD, throwing it in a wind tunnel, it's clearly giving them the results that perhaps they want a little bit more. And to cap that off finally as well, there's a little end plate cut out there. Again, me pointing at a screen, but yeah, you can see that quite clearly as well. And it just gives the airflow more of a chance to spill over, perhaps more than it would do with this arrangement here. So Ferrari's throwing everything they can at it. These are some tricks that other teams have used, and they're just kind of taking that and applying it to their own concept. So then moving on to Austria, Ferrari brought a few more bits and pieces. Now we didn't really see a lot from France to Austria. It's only a week. Obviously teams can't do panicked updates in that time going, oh, this doesn't work, and have to throw everything at it. This has obviously been something that's planned. They're going with the Mercedes concept of marginal gains here and there. And for Austria, this is a tiny, tiny little thing. They just added this little ridge to the bottom of the cuts along the front wing mounting pylon. And so they're trying to just energise the airflow going under the car around the tyres on the inside just a little bit more. And that's going to pair up with something that you see further down the car, which is these turning vanes here. Now, so you've got 6 little vanes here compared to the 5 that there were in France. On the nose cone, there are now 2 attached to it, and it's been brought further forward, so it interacts a little bit more with the turning vane, a little bit more with the internal part of the front wing, and then that's just driving as much airflow under the car as possible, keeping it on the straight and narrow, keeping it well controlled with these particular bits here, and then that just brings it towards the barge wheel package, and then that's just energising the floor a little bit more by keeping all of the dirty air away from the tyres, away from that, keeping the low pressure air under the floor, doing its thing. And so they've got a little bit more downforce, at least that's the intent anyway.
Ed, some interesting upgrades there from Ferrari, and proof that they are throwing big and small pieces at the car to try and get a better understanding really of why their season has been so inconsistent. Now in 2 of the last 3 races, they've had the fastest car on ultimate pace on the weekend, so Canada and Austria. Is that a sign that all of these updates are working, or is there perhaps another area of performance where we should be looking to pinpoint Ferrari's advantage at the moment?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. I think in terms of certainly looking France performance versus Austria performance, the big difference was the car had a stronger front end in Austria. That suggests the upgrades are working in some way, shape or form. It's always very difficult because you think stronger front end just means more downforce at the front. Things are not necessarily that simple. There's a lot going on there with ride heights, and you have ground effect, the impact of the wheels. It's very, very complicated. But you'd say there's reasonable evidence that certainly in the types of corners they're on there, it was working reasonably well. But track characteristics are a huge thing. Now, both Montreal and the Red Bull Ring, they're both circuits that do favour straight line performance. If you look at Austria, you've got basically a straight corner, long straight up the hill, corner, long straight, and then sort of medium fast twiddly bits in the middle, but not particularly slow. And so what we've seen is Ferrari has a big advantage on the straights. That tends to continue at all circuits, and then Mercedes catches up in the corners. putting it simply. But the Ferrari is stronger on the quicker corners than the slower corners. So the ideal circuit for to compensate for the advantage that Ferrari has on the straights would be one, A, with less straights, and B, with lots of slow corners. Austria didn't provide that, so you could see the Mercedes just couldn't make up the difference. On top of the other problems that they had, certainly in race conditions with cooling. So I think Austria was a good circuit for Ferrari. So was Montreal, and similar to Bahrain actually. Maybe Bahrain and Austria you can say are closer together perhaps than Canada and Austria. But I think that's positive that they've been able to address some of the dynamic problems they've got in the car. It's a slightly capricious beast, the Ferrari. They do struggle to get the best out of it. Of course, they were trying to get the 2018 tyres brought back. They had a vote. They needed 7 teams. They only had 5 teams, including themselves, on side. So that's not going to happen for the second half of the season. But I think that point that JBL made about Ferrari saying that the France upgrades dictate the path for the rest of the season, you can be cautiously optimistic that they're going in the right direction. Of course, we may go onto a circuit with slower corners, different corner types, and they're struggling again. But certainly in the hands of Leclerc, who was the quicker of the 2 Ferrari drivers, the Ferrari was working well in the corners. So a little bit of both. But I think probably if you had to bias that, you'd say the track characteristics were the more powerful influencer of Ferrari being on strong form. So still work to do there.